In the summer of 1014, in a mountain pass in what is now Macedonia, the Byzantine Emperor Basil II captured 15,000 Bulgarian soldiers in a single battle. He had been fighting these men, their fathers, and their grandfathers for the better part of 30 years. And now they were his. What he did next was remembered for 1,000 years. He divided the 15,000 prisoners into groups of 100. From each group, he selected one man and put out one of his eyes. The other 99 he blinded completely, both eyes, gone. Then he sent them home. 15,000 men walking back to Bulgaria in darkness, guided by the one-eyed men chosen to lead them. When the Bulgarian Tsar Samuel saw his army return, not dead, not imprisoned, but blinded, the chronicles say he suffered 2 strokes and died within 4 days. The act was calculated, deliberate, and perfectly targeted at the one thing more devastating than military defeat, the complete psychological destruction of an enemy's will to continue. It was not the whole of Basil II. It was one moment in a 50-year reign that was arguably the greatest in Byzantine history, a reign that began in humiliation and ended with an empire stretching from the Danube to the Euphrates. This is the story of how he got there. Basil II was born in 958, the son of Emperor Romanos II. When his father died in 963, Basil was 5 years old. His mother arranged for a military general named Nikephoros Xiphias to marry her and serve as co-emperor, real power passing immediately to someone else. Xiphias was a military genius and a brutal administrator. He was murdered in his bed by his own nephew John Tzimiskes in 969. Tzimiskes then became emperor while Basil, now 11, continued to hold the title without the reality of power. When Tzimiskes died in 976, Basil II at 18 was technically senior emperor for the first time. But a powerful eunuch official named Basil Lekipinos had been running the empire's administration for years and had no intention of surrendering control to a young man who had never governed anything. For the first years of his nominal reign, Lekipinos managed the treasury, made appointments, and conducted policy. Basil watched. He learned. He waited. And he observed with cold clarity exactly how power actually worked, who controlled money, who controlled loyalty, who could be bought and who could not. The education he received in those years of powerlessness was not the education of a prince. It was the education of a survivor. Watching regents rule in his name, watching generals plan coups against him, watching the machinery of the most sophisticated state in the medieval world operate without him, he learned it all. And when he finally took real power, he used what he had learned with a precision that nobody who had dismissed him expected. The years of powerlessness had produced exactly the ruler Byzantium needed and the one the Byzantine aristocracy had most reason to fear. The test came almost immediately. In 976, military commander Basil II launched a full-scale rebellion. He controlled significant forces in Anatolia and had genuine support from the military aristocracy who preferred a proven general on the throne to an untested young emperor. Basil did not have the military experience to crush it personally. He turned to another general, Basil Xiphias, who defeated Skleros after years of brutal campaigning. Skleros fled to the Abbasid court in Baghdad. Problem deferred. Then, in 987, Xiphias himself rebelled. This was catastrophe. Xiphias was the general who had saved his throne, and now he was using that loyalty to take the throne for himself. He allied with the returning Skleros. 2 rebel generals who had been enemies joined forces against Basil. Their combined forces controlled most of Anatolia. Basil was left with Constantinople and very little else. His treasury was nearly empty, his armies split or defecting. He needed help from outside the empire and made the decision that would change the course of history for both Byzantium and Russia. He wrote to Vladimir, Grand Prince of Kiev, and offered something no Byzantine emperor had ever offered a foreign ruler, the hand of his Porphyrogenita sister Anna in marriage. Giving a born-in-the-purple princess to a pagan Norse-descended prince was unthinkable by Byzantine standards. Basil did it anyway. In return, Vladimir sent 6,000 Varangian warriors and converted to Christianity, redirecting the spiritual trajectory of Russia for the next 1,000 years. With the Varangians, Basil broke the rebellion. Phocas died in battle in 989. Skleros surrendered. At 31, Basil II was finally actually in charge. The Basil II who emerged from the decade of regents and rebellions was not the man anyone had expected. Byzantine emperors were supposed to be figures of ceremony, surrounded by elaborate ritual, accessible only through layers of protocol. Basil stripped most of this away. He read his own dispatches. He made his own decisions. He ate simple food, slept without luxury, and drove himself at the pace of his soldiers. He never married and produced no heirs. His complete absorption in the business of ruling left room for nothing else. He had a particular hatred of the military aristocracy, the great landed families who had used their private armies to make and unmake emperors for a generation. After breaking the Phocas and Skleros rebellions, he systematically legislated against them. He revived laws limiting how much land powerful families could accumulate. He implemented the Allelengen, collective tax responsibility, that made wealthy landowners pay the tax debts of their poorer neighbors. This made him genuinely hated by the class that normally controlled Byzantine politics. He was not trying to be loved. He was trying to build something that would last. He collected taxes with a rigor that eliminated the exemptions and corruptions that had siphoned revenue away from Constantinople for generations. He prosecuted the powerful families who had been skimming from the system. His officials were well paid and closely supervised. The administrative machinery that had always tended to become a system for the enrichment of officials was kept under tighter control during his reign than at almost any other point in Byzantine history. He was building an empire that could fund the wars he intended to fight. The wars he had already started. The war with Bulgaria was not something Basil chose so much as something he inherited and refused to leave unfinished. The Bulgarian Empire under Tsar Samuel controlled most of the Balkans, had repeatedly defeated Byzantine armies, and had humiliated several of Basil's predecessors. In 986, before consolidating his internal position, Basil had led an army into Bulgaria and suffered a catastrophic defeat at the gates of Trajan, ambushed in a narrow pass, his army destroyed, barely escaping with his life. He did not forget it. He did not forgive it. For the next 3 decades the war with Bulgaria became the central project of his reign, not a single decisive campaign but a systematic, patient, methodical operation of conquest unlike anything Byzantium had attempted in the Balkans before. He campaigned year after year, taking fortresses, raiding Bulgarian territory, dismantling the infrastructure of Bulgarian power piece by piece. Tsar Samuel was his equal as a commander, resourceful, determined, loyal to by his people. For 20 years the two men fought to something approaching a standstill. Neither could deliver the knockout blow. Until the summer of 1014. Until the pass at Clydian. Samuel had fortified the pass at Clydian with a wall and a garrison, the kind of narrow mountain defile that negated Byzantine numerical superiority and turned geography into a weapon. He had used terrain like this before. It was how Bulgaria had survived against a larger empire for so long. What he did not account for was a Byzantine general willing to climb through what the chronicles describe as pathless mountains to come at him from behind. The trap that had protected Bulgaria for 30 years was about to be turned against it. Basil sent General Nikephoros Xiphias with a force to find a way around the Bulgarian wall. Xiphias climbed through pathless mountains over ground so difficult the Bulgarians had not defended it, they did not believe an army could cross it. He found a way. He came down behind the Bulgarian position as Basil's main force attacked from the front. The Bulgarian army was caught between two forces with nowhere to go. What followed was not a battle so much as a collapse. Thousands killed. 15,000 captured. Samuel escaped with his son's help. But the army that had defended Bulgaria for decades was gone. Then came the blinding. Basil made the decision personally and implemented it systematically. One man in every 100 kept one eye, to lead the others home. The rest were blinded completely. It took time. Blinding 15,000 men is not the work of an afternoon. It was carried out as an organized military operation, not a spontaneous act of rage. This is important. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was a message, delivered with bureaucratic precision: I can do this to you. I am sending you home so that everyone in Bulgaria can see what resisting me costs. Samuel saw his army return, not dead, not imprisoned, but blinded and shambling back across the border. The chronicles say he suffered 2 strokes in quick succession and died within 4 days. Whether literally accurate or embellished, the effect was real. Basil had understood something most rulers only glimpse: it is not enough to defeat your enemy. You must make them understand that continuing to fight you is a form of madness. Bulgaria did not immediately collapse. But its will was broken. And Basil was not finished. Bulgaria did not collapse immediately after Clydian. Samuel's son Gavril Radomir continued resistance. He was murdered by his cousin Ivan Vladislav within a year. Ivan Vladislav continued to fight. Basil pressed forward relentlessly, campaigning through 1015, 1016, and 1017, taking fortresses and cities, accepting surrenders where offered, crushing resistance where not. He was in his late 50s, had been campaigning almost continuously for 2 decades, and drove himself harder than men half his age. In 1018, Ivan Vladislav died during the siege of Dyrrhachium. The Bulgarian nobility surrendered. The Bulgarian Empire, a major power for 3 centuries, ceased to exist. What Basil did next revealed something important. He did not devastate Bulgaria the way a conqueror might be expected to. He allowed the Bulgarian aristocracy to retain their lands and titles, incorporating them into the Byzantine system rather than destroying them. He confirmed existing laws and tax arrangements. He established the Bulgarian Archbishopric of Ohrid, giving the Bulgarian church identity within Orthodox Christianity while keeping it integrated into imperial structure. He was brutal in conquest and remarkably moderate in settlement. He understood that destroying conquered people is expensive and produces only resentment. Making them stakeholders in the new order is cheaper and more durable. Bulgaria remained quiet for the rest of his reign. The people who had fought Byzantium for a century became Byzantine subjects without the continued resistance that often follows violent conquest. This was not an accident. Basil had calculated the settlement as carefully as he had calculated the blinding, understanding that both were necessary, that the terror that broke Bulgarian resistance and the moderation that kept it broken were 2 parts of the same strategy. He was, throughout, not cruel for the sake of it. He was effective. The distinction mattered enormously to him. The military campaigns dominate the historical memory of Basil II, but the campaigns were possible only because of something less dramatic: his administration of the empire's finances. The Byzantine treasury when he took real power was in poor condition. Years of civil war and Varangian payments had drained it. By the end of his reign he had accumulated a surplus that contemporaries recorded with disbelief. Some sources give the figure as 200,000 pounds of gold, an almost incomprehensible sum for the medieval world. He achieved this through the same patient, relentless methodology he applied to his military campaigns. He collected taxes rigorously and without the exemptions that had siphoned revenue away from the central government for generations. He implemented the Allelengend, making wealthy landowners responsible for covering the tax debts of their poorer neighbors, which was deeply unpopular with the aristocracy and highly effective at preventing the tax evasion that had always depended on noble protection. He prosecuted the powerful families who had been skimming from the system. His officials were well paid and closely supervised. The administrative machinery that had always tended towards self-enrichment was kept under tighter control during his reign than at almost any other point in Byzantine history. He was not loved by the people who ran the system. He was not trying to be loved. He was trying to build something that would last, and he understood that building things that last requires willingness to be hated by people who benefit from what you are replacing. The treasury surplus he accumulated funded 30 years of Bulgarian campaigns, operations in Syria and the Caucasus, and the Varangian Guard that had saved his throne. He paid for everything he did. This was not a coincidence. It was the point. The war with Bulgaria was the defining struggle of Basil's reign but not his only campaign. While grinding through the Balkans, he simultaneously conducted military operations in Syria and the Caucasus that expanded Byzantine territory and influence to a degree not seen in centuries. In Syria he pushed south against the Fatimid Caliphate, establishing Byzantine dominance over northern Syria and securing tribute arrangements that brought wealth to Constantinople without the cost of permanent garrison. He did not overextend. He took what he could hold. In the Caucasus he conducted a complex diplomacy of pressure, negotiation, and selective military force against the Armenian kingdoms. Christian by faith, fiercely independent by temperament, and strategically located between Byzantium and the growing Seljuk threat from the east, the Armenian kingdoms were valuable prizes and dangerous commitments. By the end of his reign several had accepted Byzantine suzerainty and willed their territories to the empire on their rulers' deaths. In his lifetime it looked like triumph. The strategic consequence, removing the buffer against the Turks, would not be paid until after he was gone. He also planned a campaign to reconquer Sicily from the Arabs, an ambition that had consumed several of his predecessors. He assembled a fleet and an army. Then he died before the campaign could launch, in December 1025, at the age of 67, while still planning the expedition. He died working. It is the most completely Basilian ending imaginable, not in a blaze of final glory but at his desk, with the next campaign already mapped out, the next problem already being solved. The empire ran out of emperor before the emperor ran out of plans. The relationship between Byzantine emperors and the Orthodox Church was never simple, and with Basil II it was more complicated than most. His faith was genuine and his support for the Church as an institution was consistent. But he was also an emperor who believed that everything within the empire, including the Church, was ultimately subject to imperial authority when the two came into conflict. When Patriarch Sergios II showed signs of asserting too much independence, Basil replaced him. The message was consistent: nothing in the empire was above the emperor. He was deeply involved in the conversion and ecclesiastical organization of Bulgaria after conquest. He established the Bulgarian Archbishopric of Ohrid, giving the Bulgarian Church a degree of autonomy within the Orthodox world while keeping it formally under Byzantine influence. A conquered people with their own church that acknowledged Byzantine ecclesiastical authority was more stable than a conquered people with no church at all. This was the same logic he applied to the Bulgarian aristocracy. Give people enough of what they value to make them stakeholders. Keep ultimate authority firmly in your own hands. The Orthodox Church eventually canonized him, placing him among the saints. There is a certain irony, given that the act for which he is most remembered is not obviously consistent with the teachings of the faith he practiced. But the church remembered what he built, which outlasted what he destroyed, and judged him accordingly. The blinding of 15,000 men is remembered. The empire he defended and extended, which protected Orthodox Christianity for another 4 centuries, is what earned the canonization. Both things are true. He was both things simultaneously. When Basil II died in December 1025, the Byzantine Empire was the largest it had been in 400 years. Its northern border ran along the Danube, with Bulgaria fully incorporated as a province. Its eastern border extended into Armenia and northern Syria. Its Mediterranean coastline was secure. Its treasury held 200,000 pounds of gold. Its army was the most effective fighting force in the Christian world. The empire he left was the product of 50 years of grinding, patient, methodical work, achieved not through a single brilliant campaign but by showing up, year after year, in every corner that needed attention. Contemporary sources struggle to capture him because he does not fit the model of the charismatic medieval ruler. He was not physically imposing in the way of warrior kings. He was not eloquent in the way of scholar emperors. He did not build monuments to himself. He built an army, an administration, and a treasury, and let those speak for him. The historian John Skylitzes describes him with admiration and something close to unease, as a man perfectly suited to the demands of power in a way that made him difficult to fully understand as a human being. His complete absorption in ruling left little room for anything else. Perhaps that is accurate. Perhaps the man and the emperor were genuinely the same thing, with nothing left over. It would explain both his extraordinary effectiveness and the somewhat cold feeling his historical record produces even in those who admire what he accomplished. He was not a person who invited love. He was a person who got things done. In a world where getting things done required a willingness to blind 15,000 men and to tax the aristocracy into fury and to campaign for 30 years in the mountains of Bulgaria, he got things done. Basil II had no children. He had never married. His heir was his younger brother Constantine VIII, who had spent Basil's entire reign living a life of luxury and pleasure while his brother ran the empire. Constantine was 65 when he inherited sole rule. He reigned 3 years, made no significant decisions, and died in 1028. What followed was the catastrophe Basil had spent his reign trying to prevent. The military aristocracy he had contained began to reassert itself. The Allilengen was abolished almost immediately. The revenues he had accumulated began to drain away. The administrative rigor that had kept the treasury full relaxed into comfortable corruption. Within 50 years of Basil's death the empire suffered massacre, a defeat in 1071 against the Seljuk Turks that cost Byzantium most of Anatolia, the heartland of its military recruitment and agricultural wealth. The Armenian kingdoms he had incorporated as a buffer were no longer buffers, they were provinces whose defensive populations had been absorbed. When the Turks came there was nothing between them and the empire's core. This was the strategic consequence of an expansion that had seemed, in 1025, like pure triumph. Basil had built something extraordinary. He had not built something that could survive without him. He had produced no one who could replace him and had made no institutional reforms capable of operating without his personal supervision. The empire that survived him did so for 400 more years, not because of what came after him but because of the structural strength he had built into it. 400 years is not a small thing. But the trajectory after 1025 was always downward from the peak he had reached, and the peak was reached by one man's will alone. When the will was gone, the peak began to erode. There is a famous portrait of Basil II in a manuscript illumination from shortly after his death. He stands in military dress rather than the jeweled robes Byzantine emperors typically wore in official portraiture. He looks not like an emperor performing imperial majesty but like a soldier who happens to be an emperor, compact, direct, and utterly without vanity. The angels flanking him seem almost decorative by comparison. He overwhelms the religious iconography around him simply by looking so thoroughly, uncompromisingly real. How do you judge Basil II? He blinded 15,000 men. He destroyed an empire that had existed for 3 centuries. He taxed and squeezed with a ruthlessness that made him genuinely hated by the powerful throughout his reign. He was not a person it was comfortable to be governed by if you were wealthy or Bulgarian. And yet, the Byzantine Empire he inherited was fractured by civil war, nearly bankrupt, and under pressure on multiple borders. The empire he left was the largest and wealthiest it had been in centuries. He achieved this not by luck or birth but by 50 years of intelligent, relentless, personally demanding work. He would not have apologized. Apology was not in the vocabulary of his reign. What he leaves behind, across the distance of 1,000 years, is something like all. He was one of the most effective rulers in the history of the medieval world, not one of the most attractive, not one of the most beloved, not one of the most admirable in any simple moral sense. But if you needed someone to take a fractured, embattled empire and forge it into something that could last, Basil II was that person. The empire outlasted him by 400 years. That is his monument. Cold, immovable, and built to endure.